What if I told you that your future self already exists and that it might be trying to guide you right now? This is Carl Jung's most beautiful and most frightening theory. We're not talking about destiny, but direction and inner calling that many ignore. Why do you pay attention to certain things and not others? Why do you try to change but always end up in the same place? Could your willpower be sabotaged by a part of yourself you don't even know? Today you'll understand what's behind all of this and discover what happens when you finally listen to who you really are. There's a deeply transformative idea that runs through Carl Jung's writings that what we call our future self isn't a fanciful projection nor an unattainable ideal, but a living reality already pulsing within us. It's not about imagining what you want to be, but recognizing that this being already exists in potential, silently working behind the scenes of consciousness. This more complete, more integrated self already knows the way. And it's often the source of our restlessness, strange dreams, and inexplicable impulses. What we call intuition might just be its way of whispering directions. What if, instead of imagining ourselves walking toward an ideal, we were simply trying to remember who we are? The most impressive thing is that this more evolved self doesn't depend on linear time. In the unconscious, time doesn't follow a straight line. And because of this, what's to come already influences what's being lived. How many times have you had an inexplicable feeling of being out of place, of being less than you should be? These signals don't come from the rational mind, but from the deepest part of yourself, which recognizes the misalignment between who you are today and who you're destined to become. And perhaps the discomfort we feel isn't a punishment, but a call, insistent yet subtle, pointing to an internal direction we haven't yet dared to follow. Some people, for example, report feeling drawn to activities, places, or knowledge that don't make sense at first glance, as if something inside them already knew where to go, even before the mind understands why. That's why practices like reflective writing, dream analysis, and deep meditation aren't mere rituals of self-knowledge. They are doors through which this future self can manifest more clearly. And the quieter the mind, the easier it becomes to perceive that attention. Well, it might be the most direct channel between what you're living today and what already exists, waiting on the horizon of your consciousness. Attention is often underestimated. Seen only as a focusing tool, it's typically trained for productivity, but rarely understood as an instrument of psychic transformation. Jung, in exploring the mechanisms of the unconscious, shows us that what we choose to observe expands, organizes itself, and takes symbolic form. In other words, by turning our attention to certain internal contents, be they sensations, memories, or images, we illuminate them with consciousness, allowing the future self to act more clearly in the present. Attention, then, is not neutral. It is creative. Directing the gaze is, in profound terms, making space for the invisible to become visible. And what happens when our attention is hijacked by external stimuli, constant noise, and automatic distractions? It fragments. And in fragmenting, it disconnects us from ourselves. It's like trying to hear a melody in a room full of simultaneous voices. The future self, which speaks in a subtle language, symbolic, intuitive, non-linear, loses its chance to be heard. So it's not just a matter of focus, but of silence, of creating pauses, of recognizing that the true gesture of power isn't in trying to control what you think, but in choosing what you nurture with presence. Attention is the gesture of commitment to what we want to make real. That's why addiction, whether to substances, habits, or thoughts, isn't just compulsive repetition, but a fixation of attention in a cycle that feeds the self of the past, not the self of the future. Jung knew this when he said, "What we do not confront in ourselves, we will meet as fate." Every time we divert attention from what provokes us, but also transforms us, we surrender our energy to stagnation. On the other hand, When we look courageously at what is still embryonic within us, we begin to perceive that attention is destiny. It's what makes us cross the limits of now toward a more conscious and integrated version of what we already are, in essence. Every addiction, no matter how trivial it seems, carries an unanswered question. Why do I keep doing this, even knowing it destroys me? Jung saw this repetition as a reflection of an internal battle, a struggle between the current self, still trapped in old patterns, and the potential self, trying to emerge from the pain. Addiction, in this sense, isn't the enemy, it's the messenger. It reveals that there's a part of us that hasn't been heard, an emptiness we try to fill with anything that takes us away from discomfort. But by numbing this discomfort, we also silence the call of our future self. Thus, we create a prison made of immediate relief, where each repetition takes us a little further from what we could be. This struggle between two selves doesn't happen in obvious ways. It expresses itself in decisions that seem small: postponing a dream, procrastinating a choice, giving up on yourself before even trying. This is where self-deception lies. One side in us cries out for change, while the other insists on staying where it's safe, even if it costs us our vitality. Jung called this psychic splitting, an internal division where opposing forces vie for the direction of consciousness. And when we don't recognize this division, addiction takes control. It offers us a false sense of stability, but at the cost of a repetitive existence, where the past dictates the future and the present becomes merely an extension of what has already been. But there comes a moment when this silent battle becomes unsustainable, when the future self begins to shine more brightly, even under the rubble of routine. This is when awakening happens, not as a sudden break, but as a subtle shift of attention. Something within us begins to observe, question, refuse to repeat. This movement marks the beginning of reintegration. Addiction ceases to be seen as moral failure and comes to be understood as an attempt at survival. And it's precisely in this understanding that transformation is born. True power isn't in defeating the sabotaging self, but in illuminating its origin, and thus allowing it to reconcile with the self we were meant to be. There is a type of attraction that comes accompanied by fear, an inexplicable fascination with that which also provokes repulsion. It's the gaze that hesitates, the step that approaches and retreats. In Jungian theory, this phenomenon has a powerful name: shadow magnetism. What attracts and frightens us at the same time usually points to an aspect of ourselves that was banished from consciousness. And the more repressed it is, the more magnetic it becomes. This paradoxical energy, desire, and fear fused reveals much more about who we are than we imagine. Because what we avoid touching usually holds the key to what we most yearn to live. Desire is the arrow that points to our hidden potential. Repulsion is the defense created by the ego to prevent us from touching this unknown territory. When we feel this conflict, Jung invites us to look inward and ask, what exactly attracts me here? And what exactly scares me so much? Often, what we fear is precisely the loss of control, identity, stability. But what lies on the other side of fear is expansion, a new version of ourselves that we haven't yet been able to sustain. That's why many of our most important choices involve this play of forces. One part wants to advance, the other wants to protect what has already been built. It's in this field of tension that destiny takes shape, because what we choose to face or avoid silently molds the direction of our journey. The shadow, then, isn't just a reservoir of traumas or weaknesses. It's also the womb of our unexplored power. What we haven't yet dared to be, but which pulses beneath the surface, waiting to be seen. That's why every great turning point in life begins with a simple movement, the courage to face what paralyzes us. And when we do this, something begins to change, not on the outside, but within. Because true change doesn't happen when we run from fear, but when we decide to walk with it. Most people believe they control their own attention, as if the mind were a flashlight that can be pointed wherever we want. But in practice, what happens is quite different. Our attention is selective, yes, but not always consciously. There's something deeper operating silently behind the scenes, the unconscious. It acts as an invisible filter, deciding what comes into focus and what's left aside, based on internal stories, unresolved traumas, hidden desires, and forgotten memories. What you call spontaneous interest is often just the visible surface of a psychic movement you don't perceive, but which guides you with immense force, like a current beneath the calm waters of a lake. Carl Jung called this the process of inner orientation. Your psyche is constantly trying to organize the chaos of experiences, creating symbolic meaning that often escapes rational logic. When something intensely catches your attention, be it a face, an idea, or even an addiction, it's worth asking, what within me is asking to be seen through this? What is my psyche trying to show me? Attention, in this context, is a bridge between the unconscious and the conscious, between what you don't yet understand about yourself and the path of self-discovery that's being silently suggested. Nothing that deeply attracts you is by chance. There's a symbolic reason behind it. This perception changes everything. Because instead of trying to control attention with force and focus, as if it were military discipline, you begin to open yourself to listen to what it's trying to communicate. Attention ceases to be a productivity tool and becomes a mirror of the soul. The problem is that without this conscious listening, you end up at the mercy of external stimuli that manipulate your attention, social media, news, comparisons, and pull you away from your own center. When you understand that your attention is in service of a larger process guided by the unconscious and potentially oriented by your future self, everything changes. You begin to use your attention as a ritual of reconnection with what truly matters. And that's where the conflict between desire and distraction begins to take on another layer. Willpower is one of the most overrated concepts of our time. We're taught from an early age that all you need to do is want something badly enough to get it, that it's just about having discipline, focus, and determination. But if it were that simple, why is it so hard to change a habit, quit an addiction, or maintain a healthy routine for more than a few days? The truth is that the mind doesn't control itself with the mind. When we try to force a change without understanding what's behind the behavior, we end up locked in an internal battle that's already lost. It's like pulling the reins of a horse without knowing where it wants to go. At some point, it will rebel. That's why self-discipline fails, because it ignores the origin of desire, the true motive behind the impulse we want to suppress. Desire doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from deep layers of the psyche, where live the images, traumas, archetypes, and effects that silently shape our attraction to things. When you feel the urge to repeat a habit that sabotages you, like biting your nails, procrastinating, or getting lost in social media, you're not dealing with a simple lack of willpower. You're dealing with an internal call that hasn't yet been understood. Trying to silence this call with rational commands is like shouting orders in a language the unconscious doesn't speak. And most curious, the more you try to control, the more you move away from the true root of the behavior. There's a much more effective path, and paradoxically gentler. Instead of repressing, observe. Instead of judging, investigate. Why does that specific urge always arise at that time of day? What is it trying to compensate for? What is it hiding? Self-knowledge is not just a pretty word. It's the most powerful tool for anyone who really wants to transform their life without depending on empty promises or goals that only last until Sunday night. And as this deeper gaze strengthens, something curious begins to happen. There exists within each of us a silent image that watches us from afar, our future self. This self isn't just a projection of desires or goals. It's an archetype, a symbolic force that guides our individuation process, as Jung described. While most people try to build their future based on logic and planning, those who approach this archetype begin to feel a kind of internal direction. It's as if, instead of choosing where to go, you begin to remember who you need to become. The future self doesn't shout, doesn't impose itself, but whispers through intuitions, inspirations, and even crises. It's an invitation to stop living on autopilot and start walking with purpose. But this guiding image only reveals itself to those willing to listen, and this listening isn't simple. Because the future self doesn't speak the language of the ego, it manifests in recurring dreams, in the feeling of being in the wrong place, in encounters that seem accidental but carry meaning. It also appears in life's repetitions, patterns that impose themselves until you accept the call to change. That's why, often, the most difficult moments in life aren't punishments, they're messages. They're ways of pushing you in the direction you've been avoiding, but which you deep down know is the right one. Discomfort in this case is a reminder of the misalignment between who you are and who you're destined to become. And most fascinating is that this archetype doesn't demand that you be perfect. It only demands authenticity. Because the future self isn't interested in masks or superficial achievements, it wants you to live your deepest truth. That's why the more you align with this internal call, the easier it becomes to abandon destructive habits, resist distractions, and make more conscious choices. And when this alignment happens, life begins to conspire in your favor. The pieces fit together, the right people emerge, and even time seems to collaborate. But before that, there's something fundamental that needs to happen. Self-awareness isn't just knowing what you think. It's recognizing who is thinking within you. Jung shows us that true transformation begins when we stop looking outside for answers and start listening to what's pulsing at the center of our being. The call of the future self, this archetypal image that guides us, isn't direct or rational. It infiltrates through dreams that insist on returning, impulses that defy logic, symptoms that can't be explained by medicine, and repetitions that seem karmic. Each of these signals carries a hidden message, an attempt by the unconscious to communicate with consciousness. Hearing this call requires presence, sensitivity, and above all, courage to not ignore what can no longer be denied. But this listening is frequently sabotaged by external noise. We live bombarded by stimuli, opinions, imposed goals, and behavior patterns that obscure our connection with what's essential. Amid all this, self-awareness is like a lighthouse in a stormy sea. It doesn't change the weather, but points north. When you develop the capacity to perceive your own internal states, not to judge them, but to understand them, you begin to decipher the codes of your unconscious. You realize that constant malaise isn't weakness, but warning. That inexplicable attraction isn't random, but revealing. And that the silent restlessness isn't a problem to be solved, but a compass to be followed. Listening to the internal call isn't a one-time act, it's a continuous practice. And the more you open yourself to this dialogue with your own unconscious, the clearer the direction of your path becomes. You stop being guided by external expectations and start being moved by an internal sense. This doesn't mean everything will get easier, but that each choice will have more purpose. After all, the future self only reveals itself to those who dare to know it. And it's exactly here that attention becomes a key, or a trap, as we'll see next. Attention is the gateway to reality. Everything you perceive, feel, choose, or avoid first passes through where you direct your gaze. But what if this choice isn't yours? Jung warns us that without consciousness, we're dominated by unconscious forces that end up possessing us. In other words, you might swear you're in control of your life, but you're just reacting to narratives that aren't yours. The algorithm of social networks, desires projected by others, fears we've inherited. All of this competes for your attention, as if it were currency. And the more your attention is hijacked by these stimuli, the further you get from your own center, your true path, the internal image of the self you were born to become. There's a profound reason why we're so easily distracted. The unconscious attracts our attention to what hasn't yet been resolved within us. That's why we often feel magnetized by destructive patterns, toxic people, emotional addictions, or stories that repeat themselves. It's as if something inside us seeks to reenact the pain, not out of masochism, but in the symbolic attempt to find a way out. When you find yourself attracted to what you know hurts you, this is an invitation to investigation. What within you still needs to be seen, embraced, transformed? Attention, in this case, reveals more about your wounds than your tastes. And it's at this point that it ceases to be freedom and becomes a trap. But there is a way out, and it begins with the reconquest of inner listening. When you learn to distinguish external noise from the signals of your unconscious, your attention begins to realign with what truly matters. You stop getting lost in shortcuts and find again the trail of your own personal myth. And this rediscovery requires a reconnection with internal purpose, which we'll see next. Because only when you know where you're going can you consciously choose where to look. There is a voice inside you that has never been silenced. Perhaps it has been muffled by expectations, traumas, external noise, or the rush to adapt. But it's still there, subtle, insistent, waiting for the moment to be heard again. Carl Jung called this the self, the organizing center of the psyche which guides your individuation process. Reconnecting with internal purpose is, therefore, more than finding a life mission. It's remembering who you've always been before molding yourself to what the world expected. And this reunion begins when you direct attention inward and start deciphering the signals the unconscious sends: dreams, symptoms, repetitions, and intuitions. Purpose isn't something to be achieved, but something that emerges when you're present enough to listen. It takes courage to silence the noise and listen to yourself with honesty. Reconnection with internal purpose frequently passes through a process of letting go, releasing what isn't yours, what was inherited, what was adopted for survival, but now only delays your expansion. It's not about creating a new self, but unearthing what was buried. As you begin to honor what truly moves you, even if you don't yet know how to transform this into action, something within you aligns. Clarity begins to emerge, direction begins to make sense, and for the first time in a long time, you feel you're on the right path. Not because someone said it's the best path, but because your soul recognizes the road. This is the moment when everything integrates: the self you were, the one you're being, and the one you're destined to become. Attention becomes an ally again, will ceases to be conflict, and the shadow transforms into strength. But this process doesn't end here. Individuation is a continuous cycle, which deepens as you walk. Now that you understand how your future self already exists and influences your choices, the question that remains is, are you ready to hear it? What would you do differently if you knew that part of you already knows the way? It's no longer useful to try to control everything with blind willpower. It's time to reconnect with your essence, understand your deepest desires, and transform your attention into a compass. Which part of you is in charge today? The one that repeats, or the one that transforms? If this reflection touched you, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. Here we go deep. And if you want to continue this journey, watch the video that's right here on the screen. It's the perfect continuation of what you've just begun to awaken.